Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual Science Cafe, High Seas Biodiversity, a Sustainable Future Through Science and Policy at the United Nations with Dr. Cymie Payne. Just a few things. My name is Brian McGonigal. I'm the Manager of Alumni and Community Engagement for SEVS and the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. A couple things to go over real quick. This event is being recorded and it will be distributed in a follow-up email along with Dr. Payne's email address. It will also be posted on the SEVS YouTube page where you can view it. Q&A, feel free to enter any questions you have for Dr. Payne at any point during her presentation. You can enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And following her presentation, we will answer those questions in turn, time providing. With that, I am going to introduce Dr. Mary Nucci. She's Professor of Human Ecology here at SEVS and the Director of the SEVS Science Cafe program. So Mary, go ahead.
Thank you, Brian, and also welcome everyone to our last Science Cafe for spring of 2022. I'd like to take this time to introduce our speaker today. Cymie Payne is an Associate Professor in the Department of Human Ecology and Law School and Chair of the Ocean Law Specialist Group for the International Union for Conservation of Nature. She has appeared as counsel before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in its deep seabed mining and IUU fisheries advisory opinion cases. Currently, she serves as a legal advisor to the International Union for Conservation of Nature's delegation to the Intergovernmental Conference for a legally binding agreement on conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. I welcome you, Cymie, and looking forward to your talk to learn more about your work regarding biodiversity on the high seas.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Brian. It's great. I wish I could see everybody in the audience, but it's great to know that you're here. And I look forward to the question and answer at the end of my presentation. So I'd like to take you with me to a couple of places. And really the subtitle for today could be Why I Spent Spring Break at the United Nations in New York. As an undergraduate, I was a biology major and I thought about being a marine biologist. Scientific knowledge still provides the motivation for what I do as a lawyer, and it provides essential guidance for international treaties. So let me explain. For those of you who aren't familiar, the two pictures that you're looking at, one is the United Nations headquarters building in New York City, and next to it is a view from the conference room within the depths of the United Nations, where national delegates, government representatives meet on a regular basis to negotiate treaties and discuss other matters of state. And you can tell when this picture was taken because you can see the delegates are wearing masks. So I'm talking about the high seas. And for most of us, that part of the ocean is a flyover zone. This is a picture I took from an airplane. You can probably work that out. And I always look out the airplane window and think, oh, maybe I'll see a whale. But of course, no, it's too far away and it's too unlikely. So we think of it as a blank zone with no life that we're familiar with. And actually, that was generally the point of view that people had in the past. They certainly imagined dragons and such, but, well, and of course there's Aquaman. But until relatively recently, we didn't have the scientific knowledge to fully understand that it's not a blank space, it's a shared space. And it's one where we're making discoveries of life at every depth. So this map shows, I really like this map because it shows the ocean the way it really is, not broken up into this ocean and that ocean, but as one connected body of water that dominates the surface of the planet. It's 70% of the planet's surface. There's far more ocean surface than terrestrial surface, with complex canyons abysses, plains, sloping up to the shallower zones near the continents. And it's in those shallower zones, relatively shallow zones, that we've found fish, oil and gas, minerals, things that humans have exploited since time immemorial. This particular map is from the Census of Marine Life, which was an international project spanning 10 years that recorded the diversity, distribution, and abundance of life in the ocean. More than 2,700 scientists from 80 nations contributed to the census. And the census itself contributed to the discovery of more than 1,200 new species and new deep sea ecosystems. The area that I'm talking about today is this very particular area. It's the light blue on this map, and it's called the high seas. That's defined by an international treaty, the Convention for the Law of the Sea. It's a shared ocean. It is beyond the national jurisdiction of any country. No nation claims sovereignty to this area. And that's the area that this new treaty will apply to. Why is it so important? Well, the high seas area covers nearly 2/3 of the ocean and about half of the planet's surface. And it's the largest habitat for life on Earth by volume. It provides about 90% of the livable space. And yet only 1% of it is protected area. The open ocean is connected vertically from the air above down through the water column's twilight zone and into subsea floor sediments. Pictured here are some of the creatures that comprise the Newstone. They're living at the interface where air meets water. And as Dr. Rebecca Helm says, this habitat is wedged between worlds, influenced by both the ocean and atmosphere, and life at the surface must adapt to this borderland. Organisms at the surface create food and shelter for diverse species, from albatross to salmon, sea turtles to sunfish. Yet we know very little about surface living species, where they live, how abundant they are, or the impacts human activity is having on their numbers. And one of her papers actually addresses the fact that because of our lack of knowledge and even awareness of this particular ecotype, there was a proposal a number of years that was ago that was actually hailed and deployed to clean up ocean plastic by skimming the ocean's surface. And the environmental assessment they didn't consider the fact that they were skimming the Newstone and basically wiping out this entire community. This really underscores the core of what I want to share with you today, which is scientific information is essential, and it has to be tied with policy so that the policy can connect with human activity so that we can protect what the scientists are studying. It's this constant interwoven relationship that we need to maintain. This is a picture of, to sort of tell you a little bit about extremophiles. So extremophiles are critters that, life forms that exist at high pressure, high temperature, low temperature. They live in extreme conditions. And so in this case, what we're looking at is a hydrothermal vent. In that vent, we've discovered that there are things that are called thermophiles. They live at temperatures of about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about the temperature of boiling water. And they live on a diet of metals, gases, and minerals. This kind of living being, if we study its properties, how does it manage to survive there? We can find things that we use. So for example, thermophiles make protein molecules called enzymes that speed up chemical reactions. Some of these, studying and using some of their genetic code, has led to products like laundry detergents that can remove oily stains. And some of the components in the materials that we use to chop up genes to actually study genetic diseases and different genes. So there's a whole range of things that we can use when we study these critters. The high seas are connected across the oceans too, to coasts, coastal fisheries and rivers. Salmon and eels migrate from the ocean to from the high seas to coasts and then up rivers, where they live out part of their life cycle in each area. Bluefin tuna roam across the seas, and many birds either migrate across the ocean. Some actually spend a lot of their lifespan on the high seas. This means that many different countries need to cooperate in conservation. Ocean life forms are also connected to deep time. Many deep sea creatures grow slowly and they live long. Blue whales like this can live to be 90 years old. And some life forms that are being discovered in deep sea sediments are believed to be hundreds of years old. There's still more to discover. We're still mapping the ocean floor, and it may be a little shocking to know that the moon is better mapped than the seabed. So we as humans have interests in the ocean. Most obviously, 50% of Earth's oxygen is produced by ocean plankton. Fish are an important source of protein. For about half the world relies on seafood as its main source of protein. We have emotional and cultural interests in the great whales and dolphins, sea turtles, the beautiful denizens of the deep ocean that we're beginning to see, like the Casper octopus, the vampire squid, and the frilled shark. The ocean absorbs heat, and about 26% of anthropogenic carbon dioxide emitted each year into the atmosphere. And there's the innovation that I just described from genetic information in life forms adapted to extreme conditions. On the other hand, we have some concerns. Overfishing is the biggest threat currently to ocean life. Shipping has multiple impacts, from ship strikes on marine, where ships actually hit marine mammals, or disrupt ecosystems like the Sargasso Sea, which is an ecosystem that is largely a mat of sargassum weed filled with complex life forms. Oil spills from ships, other pollution, and greenhouse gas emissions. Deep seabed mining is an activity that's the third column here, is something that may start next year. And there's a debate now whether the new energy economy will need the metals that deep seabed miners will dredge from the sea floor. Scientists and others are concerned that mining would destroy ecosystems that haven't yet been studied, that may be unique, and that are known to be very slow to recover, and are asking for a precautionary pause on seabed mining. Marine geoengineering proposals, if done at sufficient scale to affect global warming, are likely to have unpredictable impacts on the ocean environment that are likely to not be helpful for biodiversity. Now, these are all activities that we can control if we wish to. We can simply stop doing them. But we have another issue that we can't control that way. Greenhouse gas pollution, especially carbon dioxide, in the ocean causes warming of the water, which changes habitats. It causes species to either migrate if they can, or perish if they can't, escape to more appropriate water temperatures. It also causes acidification, which can destroy the bodies of essential life forms, many of them at the bottom of the food chain, so on which the larger animals depend. Deoxygenation is another aspect of the impact of greenhouse gas pollution, which can cause catastrophic food web collapse. And so clearly these affect human health, survival, our food supply, and potentially can lead to conflict. It's very difficult to deal with those climate change impacts, and yet we're trying to, and I'll explain that in a moment. So the UN, through the United Nations, a process was begun quite some time ago that led to the first World Ocean Assessment that came out in 2015. It's a little bit like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC process, where it's a UN associated body, but of scientists assessing and evaluating the state of the scientific information about this very important resource. So it found that the first World Ocean Assessment did a kind of baseline survey and found that many areas of the ocean had been seriously degraded. The greatest threat to the ocean, in the words of the UN Secretary General Guterres, is the failure to deal with many pressures caused by human activities. I think I included this quote from a paper by Evans and other scientists from Frontiers in Marine Science, because I thought they capture the essence here, that we need to do assessments that include ocean observation and associated research. And I hope you all know that Rutgers is one of the leaders in certain kinds of ocean observation. It has been, our marine science program has been deeply engaged in these efforts. So you should go and check out what they're doing if you're not familiar. And combined with that observation and scientific research, marine scientists working with social scientists and policymakers to use the information to address management and policy needs. And it loops around again in a cycle that when you have that dialogue between marine science and social science and policy, you identify where we need more information, which is helpful, as well as having research on things that are interesting to study. Now, we do have a treaty to try to deal with these problems. It's called the Convention on the Law of the Sea. But when it was negotiated, you may be able to tell the contrast in this photograph from the meeting of the Third Conference on the Law of the Sea, that people have cardboard signs, they don't have the electronic signs, it's mostly men. It's definitely not recent because no one has a mask on, but it's from quite some time ago. And at that time, we had very little idea about the ocean's biodiversity once we got far from coastal regions. The Convention on the Law of the Sea does not even refer to marine genetic resources, to that genetic diversity that's so prized now for both scientific and commercial reasons. There is widespread agreement that the ocean should be protected and managed in some way. For example, goal number 14 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2015, is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources. Which brings us back to this room, where in March, we continued a process of negotiation that began in 2002. And here you can see Khalil Hassani from Trinidad and Tobago presenting a proposal from the Caribbean community and the Pacific Small Island Developing States on one of the elements of the treaty. So they're presenting treaty text that they are going to try to convince delegates, the other delegates in the room, to accept and include in the treaty. So what does the treaty include? What are we looking at here? If you'll bear with me one moment there. Okay, so it's got 4 components, and it's a relatively simple structure for trying to manage all these complex activities in such a huge part of the globe. But remember, what we're trying to do is set up an agreement between the more or less 200 countries in the world. There's about 193 members of the UN, to get them to agree on some basic rules, institutions, and processes that will be with us, things that will sustain us for the next 100 years, we could hope, in our management of the ocean. So we want flexibility. Okay, so the 4 elements are a tool to assess the environment when a new activity is proposed. Environmental impact assessment requires that activity be examined for what kinds of harmful impacts it might have on the environment. And then we can decide whether the activity is worth doing, whether it can be improved so that we mitigate the harmful impacts, or whether perhaps it shouldn't be done at all. The second element is area-based management tools. And then there's 2 elements that respond more to the needs of developing countries in this context. So the environmental impact assessment, there are some questions about how we go about it, but it would essentially follow the kind of approach that we regularly use in the United States and that most countries use now when a major activity is going to take place. It's got to be, an example would be if there's going to be a big pipeline, for instance, that would go through states in the Northeast and might go through New Jersey. It would look at the route, it would look at the impact on the environment, on communities. It would allow people to speak either in writing or in public hearings and give their views. It would allow scientists to weigh in and add information that might not have been available before. And then the idea is the project will be revised based on that information and those views. And at some point that hopefully it will be a more acceptable, better project. The area-based management tools in marine protected areas. So this is a map of, you can see the world ocean, and it's showing the pink areas are areas of conservation interest. The very pale pink areas, which you can only see here in the Southern Ocean, are existing high seas marine protected areas. Oh, there's a small one up here in the Central Arctic Ocean. There's interesting places here like the Sargasso Sea off the coast of the United States and Bermuda, which is that area that I mentioned that's a floating mat of seaweed. And it turns out that that's where sea turtles go when they're teenagers, and there's special seahorses there and special kinds of fish that develop there, and eels from Europe and from North America that mature in our freshwater rivers, go there to breed and to be born. Those are all areas that are not currently protected, but under this treaty, there might be ways of either diverting ships around them, setting up protected areas that could divert ships around them, that could limit fishing, that might be seasonal, or they might be sort of permanently protected, depending on the context, the social needs, and interests to get that balance between what the ecology and the people need. The third element of this is capacity building and technology transfer. And that's where you have to remember that if you look at where science is produced and you look at a map of the planet, it won't surprise you. You might not have thought about it, but it won't surprise you that most of it is from developed countries because we have the financial resources to support science. Developing country scientists are very interested in engaging in this research. Policymakers in developing countries are very interested in putting in place laws and implementing them to protect these resources, to manage these processes. So helping them with that is an essential part of the treaty. And then this other element is as we develop more products and benefits from marine genetic resources, how are we going to share those benefits fairly? Remember, no country actually owns these resources. They're beyond national territory. So shouldn't they be shared between all countries? Should just the developed countries that have the technology to grab them hold them? No, we think that that needs to be more generous. So that's the fourth element of the treaty. So we hope to conclude the negotiation in August, and then the next step will be putting it to work. We'll be trying to get the treaty ratified by many countries. We'll try to get it to, at that point when we get enough countries, it'll enter into force. And then it'll be a question of designating marine protected areas, getting the scientific advisory body, which will be part of the treaty, established with appropriate scientific expertise and procedures, and a clearinghouse mechanism, which will be a platform to share the information that's developed through the marine protected area proposals, through the environmental impact assessment. So it will become also a focal point for scientific information. And that is where we are. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. Questions, comments, whatever.
Thanks, Cymie. Yeah, we have several questions. And just a reminder to everybody, if you do have questions, you can enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Here's a question. How difficult is it for countries to reach agreement on issues such as the high seas? What are some of the sticky issues that keep them from being willing to compromise?
Well, that goes right to the heart of it. Let's take the marine genetic resources, which is the most difficult issue in the negotiation. In the United States, we have very strong intellectual property rights, and we have a philosophy that is central to that, which is that innovation relies on the ability of a company, a business, to actually anticipate reaping a profit when it makes a big capital investment. So that, it takes a long time. If you go out and you collect these critters from the deep ocean, cruises are expensive. It takes a lot of scientific knowledge. You may not come up with much. A very small amount of what you collect will actually be useful. It then takes a lot of technology and land-based resources to turn that critter into knowledge that can be used eventually into a product. It's years and a big capital investment. So how do you make that happen if you don't have the prospect of exclusive right to sell the product at the end? Okay, so that means that the US position on this is quite hard. On the other hand, if you're a developing country and you don't have access to the capital, the expertise, the technology, and yet as a human being and as a member of the community of nations, you have a sense of an equitable right to benefit from this. And it's particularly poignant when it might be a pharmaceutical, for instance, that access to that pharmaceutical could also be not just about the money, but about access to health. So that is, I think, the most difficult issue. And it's one that's hard to resolve. There's ways, so how do we deal with that? By looking for other ways than dismantling the US intellectual property system, but looking for other ways of giving access to the knowledge, to the genetic information that's developed, to do co-production, that kind of thing. So that's just one example, and I've given you the hardest. On a lot of the issues, people just keep talking until they find common ground. And sometimes a point will be not so important to a country, but it'll also be used strategically so they can get something else they want. So you sometimes have to work through those things.
Right. Another question. In your opinion, what are some of the most important tools and technologies for exploring and protecting deep sea ABNJ?
I think, so for exploring, that is a question I would turn over to colleagues in marine science. There are a lot of new techniques now for exploring these areas that use different kinds of drones, submersibles, remote sensing technologies, the kind of things that some of our colleagues do with looking at, really microbial interactions and chemical interactions. So it's really the whole spectrum of science that can be deployed on it. I think from my point of view as a lawyer and policy specialist, it's supporting things. Oh, and I didn't mention, which I wanted to finish with, was that this is the beginning of the UN Decade of Science. And there's a lot of attention, Decade of Ocean Science. And there's a lot of attention. So you create a policy approach like that. It's like the Census of Marine Life that I mentioned at the beginning, or the World Ocean Assessment. That's kind of a policy thing to create that activity. And then that can lead to helping people coordinate and work together, find resources, identify areas for research. So I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but that's the best I can do at the moment without a conversation.
Okay. Do high seas treaties cover organisms as they move from shallower seas to the deep ocean?
Oh, yes. Nice connectivity question. So this is actually, this falls under the heading, if you wanted to Google it and, Google BBNJ and the word adjacency, because there's an artificial line that's drawn 200 nautical miles from the shoreline that is national territory. So in the legal world, once you're beyond that, you're in the high seas, right? But of course, critters move back and forth. And I'm saying critters here, of course, plants, microbes, things that aren't just animals, life forms move around much more fluidly. And so we do have to consider that. But in the treaty context, in the legal context, it gets a little tricky because how do you decide how the legal rules apply? And this is where, the conventions that we have now are truly problematic. And it's one of the intellectually interesting things we're grappling with in doing this convention is how do we overcome that problem that legal lines don't match well with ecosystems, and yet we have them, we need them.
Will the convention introduce rules about marine geoengineering?
Only to the extent that the environmental impact assessment would do that. The environmental impact assessment process would apply to any marine geoengineering project taking place in the high seas. And depending on what we end up with, this is another one of the negotiating challenges. There's very different views about whether activities that occur within sovereign jurisdiction, territorial jurisdiction, are subject to the environmental impact assessment measures. And yeah, so it might be possible to do geoengineering technologies within national jurisdiction, even if it would have a major impact, and then this treaty might not be able to touch it.
Okay. Another question is a bit of a setup here, so just bear with me.
Okay.
In regards to the marine protected areas, I have also heard of something similar in the Pacific, where some countries have sections of coastal ocean territory set aside for high protection and others set aside for use in terms of fishing. These have been shown to allow fish to sustain their populations more effectively in protected areas and results in higher yields for fishers in designated areas for use. Are there similar strategies being considered with some of these areas of interest on the high seas?
Absolutely. There's some sort of technical debate on the terminology. So the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, has a definition of marine protected areas that absolutely excludes use. And some states have, I know some of the African countries have an inclusion of sustainable use can be done within their marine protected areas. So there's some technical discussion around that question, but the actual, the slide that I showed that shows the 4 elements of the treaty, what it actually refers to is area-based management tools. And those are much less restrictive than marine protected areas. So you might have a core absolutely protected area where there's no fishing, and then around it you might have a periphery that has other, maybe would restrict shipping and deep seabed mining, but it would allow fishing. And the idea is that there's even areas like the Costa Rica Thermal Dome, which is a cyclic ecosystem. It exists in slightly different places and at different times of the year. It's an upwelling off of the Pacific coast of Costa Rica and other Central American countries. So in that case, you don't actually need to have restrictions year-round. You could have restrictions on the zone just during the most sensitive ecological moments.
Beyond research and policy, how large an issue is undocumented or unreported fishing activity?
It's a huge issue. There's a lot of fishing activity that is very damaging because of the kind of gear that's used or overfishing on particular species. Fishing that is targeting a species and then has bycatch that includes a lot of other organisms. It's fishing that is not properly managed is a huge problem. So that includes illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. And that is the most difficult issue. I should also add that the fishing industry is trying, is lobbying to have fishing excluded from this agreement on the basis that there are fisheries management organizations that already address fisheries. And that's an important issue. We certainly have to recognize that those regional fisheries management organizations can be effective. They have to be integrated. We have to make sure that this new treaty works effectively with those bodies to support their conservation measures, to work on sustainable use together.
Okay. Somebody had a question that's sort of similar. How do you deal with possible cheating? People saying they caught the fish in the managed seas when they actually caught them in the high seas.
Yeah. I was just at a really interesting workshop on using remote sensing to deal with illegal fishing, and that's a complicated question. The simple answer is you have to have good national laws so that if you can find evidence that someone has been cheating, then you can actually apply the law to it. And then you can use, for instance, satellite information. There's different kinds of satellite information that can help you identify where a vessel has been fishing. So if a vessel is located initially using the remote sensing information in the high seas in an area where it's legal to fish, and then they're within a protected area where it's not legal to fish, often they'll turn their signals off so that you can't see them. But when they reemerge from the area where they're not supposed to be fishing, you can put that kind of information together and say, geez, it looks like you spent 2 days there and you've got a load of fish. But it's complicated legal. This is like law enforcement. It's like, watching CSI.
Are there nations that are more favorable to this international cooperation? And are there nations that are less favorable to it, might be more difficult to work with? I don't know if there's a sense of that.
Yes. There's one nation, Russia, which has been very resistant. They participate in the negotiation, but they're very uninterested in having the treaty at all, and in having it be a strong enforceable treaty. I mentioned that because I think a number of people have asked me if Russia was at the negotiation and what that was like, and they were. They had a delegate there, and the delegates, you saw diplomatic decorum being observed in relation to that. Ukraine did not have a delegate there. There are other nations that are less sort of across the board negative about the treaty, that participate, but are looking for maybe lighter controls on activities in the high seas. So nations engage in very different ways. I'm partly hesitating because that's an area where I'm likely to go like way down into the weeds in a way that we don't have time for and you may not have interest in. And also because this last set of negotiations in March, which is what I'm mostly thinking about, are what we call informal informals, which means, this is like really UN Diplo speak, it means that I can talk generally about what was said, but I can't talk about most of what was discussed, identifying it with any particular country.
Okay. Are there countries that do not have any direct connection to the high seas? Are they participating in the treaty discussion at all?
Yes. So under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, in fact, landlocked countries are given special attention and their rights are acknowledged. So it's not just coastal states. And Switzerland is an example of a landlocked country that's been very active throughout the process. Nepal has occasionally spoken up. So landlocked developing states are yet another category. So that's an interesting question. And this is where I really wish that we were face to face, because I'd like to follow up with the person who asked it. and hear more about what they're thinking about.
Okay. And they can reach out to you when they get the follow-up email too.
Yeah.
What are some of the outcomes of a failure to protect biodiversity in the high seas?
In one sense, I think it's the big answer is that we know that biodiversity represents, as a concept, that it's a kind of mushy concept actually, that represents the very complex relationships between life on Earth, different forms of life, and that if that web of life starts being snipped into pieces and take a little bit here and a little bit there, we don't know how it's going to fray and how that's going to affect us. There's some obvious ways, we know that if we disrupt food chains, because we are allowing areas to become dead zones, for instance, because we know what happens when we remove predators from an ecosystem. So, we lose those key components, then we can see ecosystem collapse. At a certain point, we start seeing other kinds of effects that might affect us. And certainly, I'm from New England, I'm from Massachusetts, where in the State House in Massachusetts, there's an enormous carved wooden codfish called the sacred cod. That we know that the codfishery collapsed and it hasn't come back. So, we can see what happens when we don't protect biodiversity.
Okay. Are there actions people can take in their lives to protect high seas biodiversity? Just in everyday people's lives?
One thing that you can do is learn about what fish are long-lived, slow-growing fish, and not eat them. Yeah. Help us cut back on that industry. My colleague in the Department of Human Ecology, Dr. Bonnie McKay, will point out that we want to be concerned for the fishing communities, and especially coastal fishing communities. So, there's a more of a discussion to be had there about whether we should eat fish at all, what fish we should eat, but you can certainly avoid things like toothfish, which are very slow growing and really are not suitable for the dinner plate. I think, though, as people associated with Rutgers, one of the things that would be enormously helpful is to pay attention to these issues. I think the hardest thing is that we're not that familiar with this part of the ocean. It's not easy to get there. And most of us aren't like Sylvia Earle, who has done so much ocean diving that, well, she says, if you knew these critters as well as I do, you would feel about them the way I do. Dr. Nucci has a picture of her German Shepherd there that I think you can all see. And we look at that dog and we understand that dog, and, we know we should protect that dog. We don't know the Casper octopus the way we know that German Shepherd. So inform yourself. And if you're a scientist or a policy person, really work at bridging the communications with people outside your field, and let's figure out ways to work together.
Yeah, Mary just posted too. You can go to seafoodwatch.org to learn about what fish you should avoid eating. You can get an app on your phone too.
Excellent. Thanks, Mary.
There's another question here. Does the Biodiversity Treaty leave out any species? Does it recognize the interrelationships of organisms within an ecosystem?
Absolutely, it does. And that's when I said biodiversity is kind of a mushy concept. it really is a nice kind of umbrella concept that there is a definition in the Convention on Biological Diversity, but it's a very loose definition that's quite comprehensive. And this is really important because as we study things more, we sometimes, I mean, for people as old as I am, you know that the divisions that are made in the different life forms on Earth have changed since we were in high school. I think archaea is one thing that occurs to me that wasn't an order that existed when I was in high school. I mean, this is a label for a category of critter. Obviously, the critters existed. So we want it, when we're writing treaty language, we want to be sure that we make it sufficiently comprehensive. You know, I'm not sure where viruses fall. That's a conversation that maybe we could have with some colleagues here. But
okay. Somebody asked, treaties are important, but how about treaty management? Are there plans to put any kind of management in place? The ocean is huge. We can't be everywhere at once. How will the treaty ensure that people and countries are following treaty rules?
Great question. So there's at the moment a discussion about, which hopefully will resolve in the 2 weeks of last negotiations in August, about a implementation and compliance committee. And there's, so that's on one side, that's like a treaty structure that would take the approach that countries, if they have the capacity and engagement with each other through the treaty body, you know, sort of seeing each other at meetings and talking to each other and getting financial support where necessary, will actually introduce national laws that they will then enforce, and that there'll be enough coordination across countries to ensure that, say, someone doesn't have money in Switzerland, that they'll invest somewhere with weaker regulation that'll go out and do things that are harmful to the ocean. So that's all kind of the legal side. The other side is using the kind of remote sensing technologies, having actual enforcement capability, having some countries that are willing to send ships out and arrest vessels that are doing harmful things. I actually took out of the slide deck one of my favorite slides, which is a picture of the pirate ship, the Thunder, which it's pirate ship because it doesn't have a flag, and it was doing illegal fishing, and it was chased by the Sea Shepherd all over the Indian Ocean and up the coast of Africa, where it was finally arrested, and the crew scuttled the ship and sank it. So, you know, sometimes it's civil society that helps with these things too.
You had mentioned earlier developing countries. In these negotiations, is there an imbalance in treaty development between developed and developing countries? Do some countries get more voice or power than others?
Interesting question. There's, of course, you know, some countries have lots going for them, right? They have, like, the United States and the European Union. So the European Union's about comparable in sort of geography, GDP, and population to the US. So you could sort of think of those two together as being large, populous, wealthy, lots of technology, lots of other ways to encourage countries to follow their recommendations. And if they don't participate, then that's sort of a huge part of the country, the human activity that wouldn't be captured by the treaty. So there's a desire for them to be in the treaty. Of course, China, India would also be important players at the same scale. So for those reasons, you know, you want to have those countries in. China and India don't have the same economic clout, although they have significant economic clout, but because of the scale of their participation, they have huge weight. And then there are, for instance, the Pacific Island developing states. Well, they're small, scattered, poor. They're not huge players, but they have a huge interest in the treaty. So how do they throw their weight around? They form negotiating blocs. And so the negotiations always, and there's a formal process in the negotiation. When we're discussing a topic, the negotiating groups have the first statements. So anytime they want to make a statement, they come first in being called on. So that's the African group, the Pacific Small Island Developing States, the Caribbean community, the G77 in China. So the G77 is like all the developing countries. It's much more than 77 countries now. Those are the ones. And their Latin American group. They all speak first. Then individual countries speak, and then civil society observers are allowed to speak with intergovernmental organizations first, and then non-governmental organizations. So they do it by forming coalitions and working with others. And remember that within the United Nations, every country has one vote. So within the UN General Assembly, which has a fair amount of power, each of those countries has a vote. So they do have some voting power.
Okay, that was all the questions that we had. Thank you so much for doing this presentation. It's very interesting. As I mentioned before, we will send a follow-up email to all registrants and attendees with a link to the video recording of this, and also with Dr. Payne's email address. You didn't get a chance to ask your question, you can ask her directly. So thank you very much. Mary, if you had anything you wanted to close with.
Cymie, thank you so much for your presentation, and personally, and I think on behalf of many of us, thank you for all that you do for high seas biodiversity. You certainly are dealing with a huge issue, and we appreciate your time and effort on that. Thank you all for attending. We look forward to seeing you in the fall. We'll be back for our fall 2022 Science Cafe. Watch for notes and news. Wishing everyone a happy summer, which is coming up shortly. And thank you again, Cymie. Thank you all.